Dear audience and esteemed speakers, on behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, Trends Research and Advisory, I'd like to welcome you all today's E-Symposium, Investment in Space and Current Limits and Further Prospects. I am Abdurrahman Al-Janebi from the Conference Department at Trends, and I'll be moderating today's session. Trends Research and Advisory continues its series of discussions and seminars as part of its mission to encourage debates and exchange ideas on critical issues. Today's topic is of a great importance. It's increasingly becoming part of the future of global interactions and human progress. The space domain has become a core area of discussion in international relations as a location for innovation and security. The space race of our time is no longer a competition between two major powers. An increasing number of countries have been showing wide interest in space, seeking ways to enhance their national security and advance their military capabilities. However, this growing interest in space also comes with increased risks and challenges. Today's discussion will revolve around the future of space exploration, as well as the accompanying limitations and challenges. Without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Mr. Christopher Hersey, co-founder and board chair of Space Court Foundation. Mr. Ian Christensen, director of private sector program, Secure World Foundation. And I'm going to give you the floor, Mr. Christopher. You can go ahead.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here to speak on this topic. It is obviously a very important topic when it comes to the commercial space development, both for LEO and cislunar space. Again, thank you for inviting me here today. I'm Chris Hersey. I'm representing the Space Court Foundation. I'm its co-founder and chair of the board of directors, but I also have my consulting business, OSA Consulting, where I deal with a lot of different types of clients, both on the human spaceflight and non-human spaceflight side of the space world. The three trends that I see coming out of what I would call the post-SPAC world that happened over the last couple of years is we're sort of in an intermediate phase, it feels like. There are still investment opportunities both in the United States and globally, but they're not as largely available as before. And there's also a change because of the new development and capabilities, especially in Europe and in North America, where investors traditionally would look at revenue models, revenue projections, how those capabilities would generate revenue. And sort of base some of their decision-making, if not largely, on those metrics. And now you see sort of a milestone-based approach, which is more in line to, I think, what at least companies that are developing technologies are looking for. There is still a lot of areas where you have some innovation. And in particular, you kind of see this in the way that some of the SPACs like AE Industrial, which is the parent to Redwire, and the Voyager Holdings, where they're still looking and buying up either stakes or large equity shares in companies that are filling gaps, not only within their business model, but within the sectors that enable some vertical integration for some of their divisions. Now, the other interesting thing is, while there are a large number of companies, I would say, looking for investment, it's been hard for them to find the right sort of pairings. It's not that it's impossible or they're not having, no one's taking their calls. It's that everyone is kind of a little off center on a few things. And really what I found is it's an exercise in imagination and understanding what you need, especially from some of the startups. And from where startups were, I would say 10 years ago, 7 years ago, to where they are now, I think that a lot of the drivers are, okay, well, there's a lot more businesses out there that are supplying different parts of the industry. And how do they break in, right? So one way is to partner with larger or mid-sized companies that can provide integration, for example, or bus development, while the core company will use their in-house expertise to come up with novel, especially off-the-shelf designs for more robust, sophisticated capabilities that in particular, the Space Force is looking for, NASA is looking for, ESA is looking for, and then you have many other space agencies trying to figure out how they can get into and utilize some of these services, especially when it comes to in-space assembly and manufacturing, developing better modes to understand how we're going to address rendezvous and proximity operations, and all of the policy and regulatory issues that follow from that. And so, while there is a lot of growth, I would say it's a lot of growth in the skeleton of the industry itself. From the ground station segments to space stations to tugs and other types of capabilities, you have a strengthening, but there's still a lot to be left, I think, in terms of putting meat on the bones and getting the sinew to work together so that you can see a more robust, especially LEO economy. Let's put aside cislunar or lunar space right now. There's still a lot to be had there in terms of capabilities and investments. But just for the LEO economy, I think you have a lot of interest, but you also have a lot of uncertainty in how a lot of this stuff will come together. And at the same time, how the regulators are going to react to some of these newer type of capabilities. So overall, I would say that there is still investment opportunities, especially in non-traditional areas. Banks are also a lot more active, I think, than they were previously, although they're extremely conservative. And I haven't really seen too many examples of the banks getting into the investment. Mostly, they like to issue lines of credit. But that's not to say that there aren't equity stakes that have been offered to some companies. And some of these deals, never went through, so the public will never hear about them. But by and large, people are trying to find novel ways to get, these companies, especially startups, the funds they need to be able to put their ideas into action and get into orbit and test out these ideas, because it's very much needed to be able to build on that sinew that I'm talking about. And I think what's really going to be important is how these things, how the current post-SPAC world sort of is able to reorganize over the next few years, shore up internally. There's a lot of companies that are coming out of SPAC that are very revenue positive, and some are not. And that reflects in different internal approaches to the way that they handle their investments and their expectations. So, I wouldn't say that there's any particular sector or technology that is sort of going to help automatically grow the commercial space industry quickly, but I think it's going to be a slow and steady pace. And I think from that pace, you will see investment opportunities both on the investor side as well as the startups and sort of the bigger and smaller size companies coming together and saying, okay, where can you pair what we do well with what you can do well? And I think that will drive to a large extent the cadence, the future cadence and the current cadence of LEO commercial space development. I think overall, I think what's really important to note, and I think Ian will get into some of the details, is you have a lot more players today, than you did even 5 years ago. And that is driving additional interest, obviously, investment in space. Now, I think one area that I find interesting, but I believe is going to be very, very slow in happening, is how do we develop not LEO capabilities, because there's a lot of energy there, but how do you develop these further out cislunar and lunar capabilities? And one of the things that I think is very still under researched, underutilized is on the telecommunications side. And you have the recent Capstone mission, which I believe is still on the way to the moon. There was an anomaly that I think prevented it from doing a few on-orbit checkout objectives. But the idea that you can get Wi-Fi on the moon, the idea that you can get telecommunications in a robust way that we would experience here on Earth, through a variety of different bands, and that importation is going to be largely a psychological effort to understand what this means. And one way, obviously, is to look at users. And if you're looking at it from the perspective of just the Artemis and the Artemis Accords, for example, and thinking, okay, well, the ISS partners in China and others are looking at putting in space stations, or looking at putting at habitats and other settlements on the lunar surface, for example. I think it's really important to understand, okay, well, it's not just the exciting bit of, oh, we're actually going to create something that's going to sit there for a while and be utilized on a regular basis. It's how do you connect them all together? And that's only going to work through telecom. And I point that out because even from a regulatory point of view, the ITU doesn't necessarily have a clear jurisdiction for this. Now, there's been proposals in the past to create a fourth zone for cislunar space, where the ITU could have some input or overview on the allocation of the bands and frequencies. But right now, what I've seen is national regulators sort of struggle with this and figure out, okay, well, we have our traditional uses, we have our terrestrial uses, we have certain uses in LEO and GEO, but how does that work in further out towards the moon? And how do you bring this all together? And in particular, if you're talking about what Elon Musk and Bezos and others want to do by going back to the moon, and whether we send tourists or scientists or anyone in between, it's really important to understand that these people are going to be there for some period of time, and it's likely that yes, they'll be consumed with mission parameters, different experiments, and things that they have to achieve. But if you're talking about permanent settlement or long-term settlement, these people are going to want products and services that they would get on Earth, like Google and Apple, and that's going to require higher throughput bandwidths, which doesn't exist currently, at least on the moon. So you can't really stream Amazon on the moon right now, but I'm sure Jeff Bezos is looking at that. Now, are there others? Well, yes and no. It's still a very experimental area, and it's interesting to me that most people, at least on the investment side, are looking at those critical infrastructures that can move things around. So without having to sort of take the old model where we're throwing up all these GPS satellites and they're doing the heavy work of telecom on Earth, moving smaller constellations further and further out and setting them up is still something that's in a very nascent area of the economy. There's also been recent discussions about setting up strategic reserves, fuel reserves. Obviously, Orbit Fab has their gas stations. One of my clients, Rogue Space Systems, has the concept for orbital robots. And these things are going to be the worker bees. And it's interesting that while a lot of the investment is looking into these areas, there still isn't a lot of investment discussion for further out activities. And so I think that's an interesting juxtaposition of what value investors are seeing, because, while I said that they're looking at the difference between revenue projections and milestone-based metrics for investment, that's going to have a big impact on how quickly we can expect these technologies to be rolled out and utilized, especially if we think about, okay, space stations themselves require a lot of additional support services. So it's not just telecom, but you have the logistics of moving physical people as well as physical equipment and resupplies. And so there's a lot of opportunities which are not, I think, in a position to be fully invested in by current investors here on Earth. But it's not that they're not thinking about this. And so the way that they sort of approach that I've seen is to look at these capabilities. So if you're a company right now looking for investment, or you're a business leader who has an idea, look for the gaps, the interstices within the industry itself. Because if you can pair different parts of the space segments together and strengthen them, you likely will get investment, and you'll likely become a very vital pivot point for the development of the LEO economy. And so I think that there's a lot opportunities for further investment to shore up capabilities, assets, set technology investments. But startups really need to differentiate themselves in the market to attract near-term investment and financing. And that's just sort of the reality where we are today. So yeah, and I think that those are all my major points.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christopher. It was very enlightening to hear about how the investors are thinking and how they should be more active within that role, and how small startup companies should develop in the future. Thank you very much. I'll give you the floor, Mr. Ian. Please, you can go ahead.
Hey, good morning. I'll say, because I'm in Denver, Colorado, where it is morning. I think for our guests, most of them are probably in the evening or afternoon. So it's good to be here. So yeah, my name is Ian Christensen. I'm the director of private sector programs for the Secure World Foundation. I'll talk a little bit about what Secure World is in just a moment here. But Chris, thank you for that set of remarks. I mean, I think you talked a little bit about the types of applications and services we're seeing in the commercial space market, and the investment vehicles that we're seeing to kind of support and grow those applications, hopefully. And then as well, some of the changes that we're seeing in the types of investments. So the wave of SPACs that we saw a few years ago that was maybe a little bit out ahead of the market, and now moving into more of an acquisitions type phase. So I want to take that and start talking a little bit about what those trends mean, these investment trends, these development trends, what they mean for how we use and benefit from the space environment. So give me a moment here. I actually have a set of slides. I'm going to try to share those, and let's hope that the technology works here. So if I could get a thumbs up if the slides are on the screen there. Excellent. All right. So the importance of investment in space and its implications for development. So as I said, I'm with Secure World Foundation. Secure World Foundation is a private operating foundation or a non-governmental organization that works on cooperative solutions for space sustainability. We're based in the US. As I said, I'm in Denver. We also have an office in DC, but we work on a global basis. And for us, space sustainability essentially means, how do we as a global community continue to operate in and benefit from a stable orbital environment. So we're seeing increasing use of the space domain. We're relying upon space applications and services for a number of things in society, and there are some challenges to the stability of that orbital environment. And so we at Secure World facilitate dialogues, discussions, and conduct a little bit of research around those trends in space sustainability and those challenges. So when I say challenges for space sustainability, it's things like increasing population of space debris, trends towards geopolitical risk in the space environment, challenges of updating and making regulation more effective and more efficient for the range of new applications that we're servicing. Or that we're seeing, rather. And then so we try to work on policy and community measures to address those. So things like developing norms of responsible behavior, promoting data sharing around space traffic and space situational awareness, developing new regulatory approaches, and updating our understanding of the norms and laws that provide the principles of space governance. So those are the sort of things that we work on. Me specifically, I focus on our interactions with the commercial space sector. And so as commercial space becomes more common, as investment increases, what is the role of the private sector in promoting responsible space activity and acting in sustainable ways in the space environment? So let's start at a very high level. Why space? This is a quote from the Outer Space Treaty, which is the principal kind of governing document at the international level that sets out the principles that guide space activities and inform the regulation of those activities. Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty says that the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, irrespective of the degree of economic or scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind. So there's quite a lot here, right? This kind of sets out a philosophy for how we approach space, and that is that space activities shall be beneficial. They shall be done both for exploration and use, so we can explore space, but we also at the international level say that we can use space, and it's that use that creates a lot of the commercial that allows a lot of the commercial activity that we see, and that leads to the societal and economic benefits that we see. But space, it also talks here about all countries. It also talks here about irrespective of scientific or economic development levels. So space is a multi-stakeholder environment. The interests, benefits, and uses of space are understood and deployed differently across those different stakeholders. And that's that sort of wide range of potential understanding and potential use informs the way, or at least affects the way that we think about investment in the space domain. So when Chris and I talk about the space economy, what do we really mean? It's really notoriously difficult to estimate the size of the space economy. So here on the left side of this chart, as you look at it, is data from an annual report done by the Satellite Industry Association. And the Satellite Industry Association is a US-based trade association. They estimate the size of the global space economy at about 386 billion US dollars. Other estimates will put it around as much as 469 billion. There's something called the Space Report that puts it at that number. So that's quite a wide range. And why is that? It's because space services, things like communications that Chris was talking about, things like remote sensing, the ways in which these services are used penetrate many different levels of the economy. So it can be very difficult to say when something is truly a space activity and when something is simply using space in a way that is part of an existing other sector. So, for example, a lot of telecommunications services, right? We can count the direct revenue that satellite telecommunications companies like Intelsat or Eutelsat or SES accrue from their operations, but we can't necessarily directly track all of the ways in which economic activity is generated off of the use of those services. So it becomes very difficult to put a good size on the space economy. Also, as we look at this, we can see that there are certain areas where commercial activity is dominant, and that is in telecommunications. As you can see from the SIA number, roughly a third of that revenue number comes from what they call the satellite industry, which is telecommunications and remote sensing. Another third roughly comes from the ground segment, which is used to support those operations, and then another roughly third comes from what they call non-satellite industry, which is essentially government space exploration and government space budgets. Other areas of commercial activity are very low in revenue. There's a little bit of revenue from launch industry. There's a little bit of revenue from the remote sensing industry. But many of the areas that we're talking about in commercial space, those that Chris are talking about, are very nascent. They're new areas of activity, and revenue and economic value is just being created. So they don't create a lot of contribution to this number. Lastly, beyond the economic sizing of the space activity of the space industry, we also have indirect and societal value created by space activities. These are things like exploration and science, which results in intangible benefit to the community, such as knowledge creation, or inspiration of future generations. This doesn't translate directly to economic benefit, but is clearly a type of benefit that results from space activities. So where are we going? Forecasts talk about, these forecasts are maybe optimistic, but they talk about growing this roughly $400 billion space economy to $1 trillion space economy by the next decade. Doing that would entail expansion of business to business and business to consumer markets. It would also entail growth of new areas of activities, the LEO activities Chris was talking about, as well as the lunar activities that we see. We see a notable level of private sector venture and other capital investments to kind of take advantage of this perceived opportunity. Firm in the US, the consulting firm called Bryce Tech, estimated that startup space ventures attracted over 15 billion in total private financing, 15 billion US in total private financing during 2021, which is almost double the amount of financing the same report estimated in the prior year. Much of this financing is in the US and China, along with Europe. So where is this creating? The chart on the right side of the screen shows the estimated number of active satellites over time since the beginning, since roughly the last, I've got about 15 years of data on that chart. It comes from a couple of public tracking materials. What we're seeing is a dramatic increase in the number of satellites that are being operated. And these are the satellites that are providing this type of benefit, these type of applications. And so as I think about space sustainability and the space economy, a key aspect of space sustainability is that the actions of one actor in the space domain can affect the ability of other actors to safely operate. Growing a space economy and the returns from it will be easier if the environment is stable and there are risks, space sustainability risks to this stability. So as the number of satellites increases over time, the number of actors in space increases over time, our interactions in this shared domain become more important and more critical as we attempt to grow a space economy and promote a stable environment. So let's go a little bit into this a little bit more. This chart here shows the share of satellites launched per decade by operator type since the start of the space age in the 1960s. And what we see here is an emergence or a shift from a government-driven domain. So the blue and the orange are civil government and military government satellites. As we get into the more recent times, we see the emergence of the gray and kind of pink or light orange bars, which are the emergence of commercial operators and academic or amateur operators in space. So 1960s, 1970s, we had a government-driven domain. Currently, we have a multi-user domain, which is being shifted increasingly towards a commercial-driven domain. We currently have about 6,800 active satellites on orbit. Around half of those are operated by a single commercial operator. That's SpaceX and the Starlink constellation, which is being fielded to provide broadband communications from a very large constellation in low Earth orbit. We also see other constellations being deployed for that same market. So OneWeb is another example. They currently are operating around 400 satellites and building a constellation. Which in the first generation will be several hundred and planning a larger constellation. Other companies such as Amazon Kuiper, there's Chinese plans to develop these very large constellations as well. We also see large remote sensing constellations. So Planet is a US remote sensing operator. They currently are operating around 300 satellites in orbit. So shifting from government-driven domain to a private sector-driven domain. However, many of the key governance principles that inform space regulation were defined in an area where space was dominated by government operators. The main elements that were considered when the treaty regime was developed were military and civil space activities. This was in the Cold War context. Academic, private, and other non-government use of the space domain were anticipated but not detailed at the times that the treaty system was developed. So as private sector activity becomes more prevalent in the space domain, the pace of activity and the introduction of new services and applications, such as these large constellations, private space stations, satellite servicing activities that Chris was talking about, and lunar development, all of these things challenge the efficacy and efficiency of existing regulation. Some areas of commercial space activities lack clear regulatory processes to issue licenses. This can create uncertainty for business. It can create uncertainty for investors. Other areas, such as the deployment of large constellations, require changes to existing licensing procedures that were originally designed for less complex systems. Questions such as coordination for managing spectrum, coordination between operators for managing space safety, interoperator coordination is important to promote this stable domain that we want to see to grow economic activity and to grow benefit. However, even with this growth in the emergence of private sector space capabilities, space does remain a government-driven market in terms of funding. Governments are also competing to develop commercial space industries for national interest and economic growth purposes. So these two factors can lead to some regulatory or incentive-based competition where governments are competing to grow space economy and to grow space activity. There's a little bit of risk as this occurs that we might create further uncertainty through lack of commonality in regulatory principles. So I mentioned all this just because it's a bit of a context for the policy and regulatory challenges that might influence the emergence of more private sector space activity and more private sector space investment. So, want to come back to the question of benefit, right? Returning to the fundamental principles of the treaty, referring to the fundamental idea that we think that economic growth translates to benefit. What does benefit really mean? I think we can posit or suggest generally that for benefit to occur, activity and development must also occur. So if we don't develop, we don't use a domain, we're not likely to benefit very much for that domain. But as we said, the Outer Space Treaty talks about benefits for all countries. So we need to think intentionally about the impact of our activities on the stability of the environment. So as we use space, what does that mean for the space environment? What does it mean for our ability to benefit and use that environment now and in the future? Returns on investment and growing benefit from space is dependent upon maintaining a stable and safe operating environment. So we at Secure World are trying to do some work with the investment sector on this topic. We think the investment sector has a role to play in promoting a stable domain and growing a responsible use of space. Broadly outside of the space sector, we see a lot of interest in what is known as ESG, or environmental, social, and governance factors as a investor motivation. So this is the idea that investors are looking to invest in companies and sectors that both make money, but also make money and grow in a way that is sustainable and has a positive impact on the environment and on the community. So ESG is a way that companies can define and track performance towards environmental, social, and effective governance, corporate governance goals. So, for example, you see on this chart the emblem of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There is an investment fund out of the UK that is focused on space called Seraphim Space. They built their entire thesis around companies that can contribute to the environment or to the performance of the Sustainable Development Goals. So they're looking at investing in companies that can contribute to sustainability and can contribute to achieving the SDGs on Earth. So there's a link between their viewpoints on growing the space economy and seeing return from their investment to ESG performance. ESG, in particular the environmental part of it, is primarily oriented at the terrestrial economy right now. We do not see a lot of, or we see early discussion towards orienting ESG towards activities in the space domain. So what is environmental aspects of performance for the space domain? How do we mitigate space debris impacts in your company operations? How do we ensure that we're deorbiting satellites effectively? How do we ensure that we're as we look to lunar activities, providing room and coordination so that we have a multi-user environment on the moon? These are all elements that we at Secure World are working to build norms of practice or norms of behavior for, and working to help investors think about the ways they can influence their companies to act responsibly. So we see ESG in space as an emerging area in which there's potential to both grow investment opportunities and help us act in sustainable manners. Now, ESG is great. However, ESG does not work if there are not effective reporting and monitoring mechanisms. So we need to develop metrics to track space sustainability performance and ensure that we can compare across companies, and that there needs to be some work there. So initiatives like something called the Space Sustainability Rating, which was initiated by the World Economic Forum and is being operated out of EPFL, which is a university in Switzerland, is an effort to provide a ranking system to compare space missions and on their sustainability performance. And so things like that will help us mature ESG in the space sector. And so I think I'm going to wrap up there. Again, the idea is that space economy is difficult to measure. We do want to see growth in the space economy. As we see growth in the space economy, more private sector activities, more actors, we need to think about the systems and approaches that we can build to ensure sustainable performance as we go forward. So I will wrap it up there. Just put my email address up briefly, and happy to take questions now and in the future. So go back to the main view there. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ian. That was very insightful. And I think the questions are coming in already, and some of them are more or less very accurate to the presentation that you just showed us. So hopefully it's going to be good questions. So I'm going to start with you, Christopher, on a question that we got from the viewers. So we spoke about investments and investors. Investing in space is very costly. So what's the economic impact or benefits on such investment?
Yeah, so I'll put it from a U.S. perspective, because I think that's a little easier to translate. So in general, you say you have a company in a state, right? And obviously the immediate impact of that is you have jobs in that state. But the way that the space industry in the United States is shaped up, it really impacts multiple states now. And you have, in many cases, companies that have engineering groups in one state. They have developers that actually build the bus and the subcomponents in a different state. You may have a group of people in a completely different other state integrating them together. And this creates a lot of economic activity at a very local level, right? A very individualistic level. So it's not just about the company, generates revenue because it made sales or provided services. It has a local impact. The next level is it's feeding into the overall space economy. And as Ian pointed out, it's very hard to measure some of the aspects of the industry itself. Some of it is obscured. Some of it is transitioning in the way that it's presented itself relative to the ways it's presented itself, the economic activity itself in the past. And so there's a new way of thinking about how to measure these things and what elements compose that. But by and large, what you're looking for is how does this fit into the different segments that enable space activities? Now, in terms of the impact, it really depends on the sector. If you think about ground stations, well, do you like to get information on your phone? Because without them, you're not distributing those signals from space down into Earth into terrestrial networks. If you're thinking about the satellite, think about trying to do an international bank transaction without satellites is near impossible. It's not that it's not doable, it's just that we're used to a level of convenience now that requires near instantaneous movement of data, and then it goes and sits somewhere on a server until it's processed by a bank or somebody who's an intermediary to that bank. And then you think about, okay, human spaceflight. Let's think about human spaceflight for a second. On one hand, I noted in my initial points that you don't have Amazon operating on the moon yet, or Google TV or whatever, or YouTube TV, but the impacts. What we're looking for is how are we going to enable safety, reliability, sustainability to keep these assets in orbit. And Ian touched on some of the sustainability goals, but there's a space security aspect to that because there's a question of intent. You kind of see that now in the way that Starlink has been deployed for the Ukrainians. And you see that in the level of capacity that Starlink and others, OneWeb in particular, are processing through their program to get satellites up to process different types of data. Now, it's not all telecom, some of it's remote sensing data. And that's really important because for decision makers, for policymakers, and even those who have to enforce the law, having real-time remote sensing data is very important to enforce existing policies and laws. And in particular, as Ian pointed out, the sustainability goals. Okay, you can set goals, but how do you measure them how do you objectively measure them, right? And a photograph from space of the surface of the Earth indicating that certain companies or nations are acting in a very positive or negative way, this is a very clear indication of intent. It's a very clear indication of impact. And that could be as simple as tracking human trafficking in different parts of the planet, as well as plant growth, and using, let's say, IR technologies to understand, okay, well, are we undergoing a drought in certain regions? You look at the way, anytime there's a natural disaster, in particular, the one recently in Pakistan, you had Maxar broadcasting, images of what the impact is. And once we truly understand as a policymaker what the impact is, it's easier to decide what resources at least should be considered to be deployed to mitigate the suffering in those regions as a result of these disasters, these natural disasters. So space assets overall, depending upon where they fit within the segment, provide a lot of benefits. They enable a lot of what we understand as benefits. And I think the last point I'd like to make, is I didn't address it initially, was you also have a change in the way that people want to consume utilize services, space services. You have obviously people looking at using NFTs or cryptocurrencies, or just general investment into gaining wider access to space through democratization. So you have my client Space Hero is trying to democratize access to space through the creation of a global competition show. You also have Space for Humanity under Voyager, looking to send different types of folks for philanthropic reasons to space. You have what Jared Isaacman is doing with SpaceX. You have what Maezawa is doing with SpaceX to go around the moon with Dear Moon. All of these are, I think, for the first time, at least in terms of the volume of activity, presenting a different way to look at space, and that it's not about governments, and it's certainly not always about billionaires, but it's about finding the ways in which we can incentivize average people, normal people, to work and play and experience space. Another example, obviously, it would be what is it? I think it's, I'm going to butcher the name, but World Perspectives, Tabor and Jane's business out of Arizona, where they're going to take basically like a gondola up to about 100,000 kilometers and then slowly drift on down. But you'd have a long period of time to look over the curvature of the Earth and have that overview of experience, right? You look at relative to what Blue Origin is doing, you get like 5 minutes. Virgin Galactic, you get like 5 minutes. So there is a competition as well in terms of the types of services that are being offered to the average person who can afford it, or that meets the competition requirements. But it is changing the way that people look at space. And I think one interesting aspect for me, especially being part of the industry for almost 20 years, is the almost daily understanding and reference to the overview effect. And I think it's really important to understand how impactful that is, because the average person, unless they read a textbook or they go on Google or pick up some other resource, they have a very two-dimensional understanding of what space tends to be. And opening up that access to a variety of different types of people broadens the perspective and understanding not only that these technologies and these assets and these companies are providing services that enable all these things. But how do we as a species view these things? And it shades them to Ian's point about benefits, right? It could be as benefits to, okay, well, it's going to help decision makers figure out where to put disaster equipment and resources, let's say in Haiti. But at the same time, it's changing people's perspectives. They understand why we're doing this. Because for a long time, there's been a lot of criticism about the space industry that goes all the way back to the Mercury through Apollo of why spend all this money? Why do any of this? Well, you can single out one thing that you may not like about the industry. And a lot of people want to say, oh, billionaires are going, but that's not necessarily true. We're having a lot more firsts. And in particular, I think it's really important to understand the current trend, which is a lot more countries are sending their nationals to space. I mean, the United Arab Emirates is leading in that regard. You see the Saudi Space Commission recently announced that they're sending folks to the International Space Station. And that is a huge impact, I think, for younger generations to understand the opportunities they can have in the future. And these and countries like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia and others that can offer these things to their people and say, we are a part of this global community. It's not just about the hegemons or just about this, the old bipolar way of looking at space. It's the US versus the Soviet Union or something to that effect, or US versus China. So, this isn't as clear cut and homogeneous as I think as people maybe want it to be. It's very heterogeneous. It's very interdependent. And it is growing at a rate that is producing a lot of economic impacts, but it's very hard to measure like where the ceiling is. Obviously, the floor is always going to be failure of a regulator, the failure of a company in the way that it conducts its business, and having those failures add up over time. But a lot of these risks are mitigated by the fact that you have companies and these new companies going into regulators and having these conversations so that everyone's on the same page. Because the consequence is that one small screw up can have tremendous impact for the future of spaceflight. And if we're worried about space debris in particular, we want responsible actors. And if you or someone's consuming the services, you want to know that going into space isn't going to put me in the middle of a war zone or a debris field. And so it's really important for investors and those who purchase these services to understand this and evaluate that risk. And it's interesting that investment is sort of the first line of that risk assessment.
Thank you, Christopher. And I would really like to focus on the part that you mentioned when it comes to the next generation and raising awareness. And this is what we're trying to do here today, raising the awareness to whoever has potential or future, thinking in the future to move into space and understanding the space more and working in space or investing in space. Going to you, Ian, I'm going to give you another question. China's role in space is growing very fast. It will have its own space station and aims to put its first astronaut on the moon by 2029. How will these affect the status of the US as a dominator power in this field?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. So that's a good question. It's one that we see as a trend in the community. No pun intended. So yeah, I mean, so the two most holistic space enterprises in the world right now are in the U.S. and China, and with apologies to Europe, probably in the third position. So the relationship between the U.S. and China does have a big influence on where the space domain will go in the near future. So we at Secure World actually have a small project where we're trying to facilitate a dialogue between U.S. Commercial space actors and Chinese space industry actors to kind of build understanding, reduce some misperceptions, and try to help each side, each community understand better what the other is doing, because while the U.S.-China the U.S.-China dynamic is one of competition, there's also, in my viewpoint, a lot of exaggeration and hyperbole in how that discussion is framed. So as China pursues space objectives, it's pursuing many of the same space objectives that the U.S. has pursued and that other countries have pursued. So scientific development, industry development, and yes, development of national security and military space activities. And so what we see the need for is to build bridges so that the U.S. and China can communicate, can understand, can potentially have ways to deconflict activities if things are seen as in potential overlap. We also see some similar interests. So both the U.S. and China have an interest in using the moon for science, for commerce, and for exploration. And so there are ways in which conversations can happen that will advance our legal understanding of the way that the moon is able to be used. So, returning kind of the question, I think China will continue to develop its space enterprise. The U.S. will continue to develop its space enterprise. As those both move forward, there's going to be some tension in some points. That's an extension of the geopolitical relationship between the two countries. But I think there's also going to be some areas where shared interests will emerge, in particular around safe operations of constellations in low Earth orbit, of certain interoperability and communications protocols for lunar use, and so I kind of see I don't want to say a two paths, but I see a multiple ways in which this relationship will develop in the future, and will inform things, and also I'm just going to end. In general, competition can be bad, but it can also be beneficial, right? Competition leads to innovation, it leads to new activities, it leads to development. And so I think there are elements of U.S.-China competition that, while could increase tension, could increase potential for conflict, there are also elements that can lead towards innovation and lead towards new benefits. And so I think that aspect of competition maybe gets a little bit less discussion than it warrants, and I have a somewhat positive outlook that some of that beneficial competition will continue to occur as these two countries develop their space enterprise. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Sir. And definitely, competition usually brings the best out of the two competitors, and hopefully it's something that we look forward to that will bring growth into the market that we're in. I'm gonna ask you the question, Sir Christopher. We spoke about investing in multiple ways. I have a question from the viewers. What are the risks associated with investing in space?
Well, the first risk is you lose all your money if it doesn't work out. How do you evaluate that risk? That's what companies like Seraphim and others are. They have their own way of evaluating that level of risk. In terms of what's risky, by definition, space activities are inherently risky, like just absolutely by definition they are. And while having said that, the idea here, and certainly what SpaceX is trying to prove out, is regularity puts together processes that strengthen and enhance safety. And so while largely on the terrestrial launch side, it's clear that while, yes, it's still an inherently ultra hazardous activity, however you want, what legal terms you want to use to describe space activities, it is getting to the point where it's regular enough where one can say, okay, I'm comfortable taking this risk. I haven't really seen anyone be killed or damaged or hurt, with some minor exceptions in historical exceptions, and a lot of that being on the R&D side. SpaceX certainly is really the only commercial entity that has really commercialized regular space travel. and certainly has demonstrated with the Inspiration mission and with its crew and cargo resupply missions. But then you have a lot of other companies that are coming along. And so when you evaluate that level of risk, you want to say, okay, what part of the market segment are we looking at, right? I think for ground stations, the risk is, do you have the relationships and the business development expertise to be able to get the business off the ground? I think there's several businesses that are exemplars in that, so the Leaf Space being one. And, if you're looking at telecom, well, really the issue there is a transition in the way that things are put together. You look at the way that GEO and other telecom satellites are put together, big buses, big, huge things that need to require big rockets. But now we're down to small sats and cube sats and things between 100 and 500 kilograms. And so then, okay, then you're talking about technical risk. Well, when you evaluate that, you want to evaluate whether or not the proposed activities are within known physics. That would be the first thing I always ask. And it is always surprising to me how many people have ideas that seem to push what that means. What are the limits of physics? But that's not to say that there isn't justified research and development opportunities. And if that's the risk you're willing to take, because they showed you how they plan to do it and how they think that they can get around some of the known physical limitations. And if they pull it off, great. I mean, someone could figure out warp drive that would change our entire species overnight. But I'm not going to necessarily invest in that right now. But propulsion systems that take advantage of different aspects of the space environment, from quantum drives to solar sails, I think those are all worthy things to consider. But then you have to really evaluate the technical risk. And that's what it comes down to when you're talking about non-human spaceflight. So what you want to do with your money is always going to be what you're willing to risk, just like going to a casino. You may get lucky, you may not know. But relative to the casino, at least you get to look at the cards when it comes to space investments. You have a general idea, and if you don't, then you do have a grounds for a lawsuit because you probably have been the victim of fraud. So it's one of those things where you just gotta understand the environment you're in and make sure that if you're going to make these investments, and especially someone who's an individual investor and not part of a group, talk to people in the community to get a sense of whether or not this is worth your time and money.
Thank you, Christopher. I'll give you the floor. We have 3 minutes left. So
yeah, so just a couple very quick points to add to that, because I think everything Kristen said is just accurate. So I also point out that space is still a very nascent market outside of telecommunications. Right? It's an emerging, growing market, and I think that means that in certain ways it's more sensitive to at the market level, more sensitive to external factors than certain other industry sectors maybe. And let me give a couple examples of what I mean by that. One of them is at the public level. I don't think public markets, public investors are that familiar with the space sector. And so when companies do go public through SPACs or other things like that, markets can be very sensitive to things that shouldn't influence markets. So, example, there's a company, Astra, that went as a SPAC, and they had a 1-day launch delay, and the stock market launched. I think, Chris, I don't remember, like the stock lost like 10 or 15% of its value because of a 1-day launch delay, right? Which is entirely normal occurrence in the space world. So, public markets don't understand this sector, and so there's some risk there, volatility there. The other one is geopolitical risk, right? So, space is still a government-driven domain. Things that governments do can affect the investment environment. So, a couple of examples. Chris already mentioned Ukraine. OneWeb's investors probably didn't anticipate that their launch site would get cut off and that the business plan would suffer a multiple year delay because they had to move all of their launches away from Russian providers. The other example is things like ASAT testing, right? So a state can decide it needs to test an ASAT capability, and as Russia did, as India did, as China did, and as the US has done, in the past essentially pollute an orbit and create a bunch of operational costs for those operating in that orbit by having to increase collision avoidance. So these sorts of external factors can create risks that I think the space industry is a little more sensitive to because of its early stage.
Thank you, Ian. I would like to thank you, Christopher and Ian, for joining us today. Today was very insightful, especially the Q&A topics keep on coming up. We have more questions, but fortunately we are out of time. Once again, I would like to say thank you guys for joining us today, and I hope that this symposium was really insightful to many of our viewers.
Thanks for having us. It was good to be here.
Thank you. Bye.